D. James Kennedy Ministries presents Truths That Transform.
People under 30 in America have never been more secular.
There's no doubt that there is a certain amount of indoctrination that happens in an atheistic, humanistic worldview, because you're not allowed to talk about God, Jesus, or your faith of any kind in public schools.
The growth of secularism among young people spells the doom of the future of freedom, unless Christian parents take action. Find out how on today's Truths That Transform. Welcome to Truths That Transform, a production of D. James Kennedy Ministries, where we are standing for truth and defending your freedom. Surveys show that Generation Z, roughly the generation born in the late 1990s and onward, is the least religious generation in American history. To be sure, this is a trend that has been growing for decades, so perhaps we should not be surprised. As you will discover on today's program, America's children have been fed into an educational system that is geared to subvert religious faith and traditional morality, replacing them with Marxism repackaged for a new generation. Here is Dr. Jerry Newcomb with a report.
There's no doubt that there is a certain amount of indoctrination that happens in an atheistic, humanistic worldview, because you're not allowed to talk about God, Jesus, or your faith of any kind in public schools.
John Dewey is known as the father of American socialized education. I think our public school system is really a shrine to Dewey's vision for a humanistic-based education. In the process of elevating man, we've lost sight of God's Word. The biblical message says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. For Dewey, the beginning of his method was to disregard anything of God.
That's been a challenge for a lot of people for a lot of years, passing on their values in the schools, because as you know, public schools are really hostile to the Christian faith.
What we're seeing is the intergenerational effects of impiety and a lack of patriotic virtue. Because if you're unpatriotic and you sort of turn in your heart against America and God and family, you still remember the good things. But a couple generations down of that kind of way of acting and speaking in front of the next generation, it metastasizes, it gets worse, and the memory of the good things that you don't speak of disappear, and there's none of that balancing all of the negative speech.
One aspect of Marxism taught in the schools is critical race theory, which postulates that all of history must be interpreted through the lens of racism. There are oppressors who are white, and there are victims who are people of color.
Critical race theory posits that America is white supremacist, has always been white supremacist, and that anyone who says otherwise must be a white supremacist. Or just denying reality. So if there can only be one point of view. So America, in that case, their solution is simple. Whites have to shut up, be quiet, go along with whatever the left wants, have their children indoctrinated into Marxist economics, sociology, psychology, all the disciplines. It's pervasive in universities today.
When it comes to critical race theory, they see racism as the problem of mankind. The greatest problem of mankind is racism. And with their approach to redemption, it's a never-ending process, because it's a work that white people have to continually do while being told that their racism is permanent Anything that worked for was undeserved, that they're all guilty.
These people who are advancing, in my opinion, critical race theory are trying to push us back into a time when we saw things racially, when we treated people differently because of the color of their skin, which is of course wrong, and we shouldn't do it.
I remember seeing a headline that said, Marxism in the schools, riots in the streets. These ideas that are taught to these young children in school, they have ramification.
Well, as a nation, we are at a crossroads. Are we going to continue to be the republic that we were founded to be, where all men are created equal and have inalienable rights? Or are we going to divide up into these different tribes and factions, which is what the founders saw as a possibility?
A lot of people act like they're ashamed of America, ashamed of its past. Imperfect? Of course it is. People were involved, and therefore it's imperfect because people are imperfect. We've gotten better. And we've gotten better because we held people individually and corporately responsible. But one thing we have to do is look at our history honestly and with some integrity. Our history has empowered more people, given them the greatest levels of economic prosperity, the greatest levels of personal freedom to speak, to disagree with the government, to criticize the government, to assemble, and to encourage people to think like us. Those are some fundamental rights that we were given by God, enshrined in the Constitution and protected by government, that make us unique.
But unfortunately, the promise of America is often greatly downplayed in America's schools today. Instead, the students often get a big dose of revisionist history, such as the 1619 Project of the New York Times, which teaches America's real beginning was, supposedly, in 1619 when the first African slaves were imported.
The 1619 Project that the New York Times put out that argues, that the nation was birthed in slavery and that the Revolutionary War was fought to maintain slavery. And so there are false narratives about our nation, and it's important for Americans to recognize that the Declaration of Independence is what makes America so special, along with its Constitution and its Judeo-Christian roots. And with the Declaration of Independence, of course the people that authored it, and Thomas Jefferson in particular, they were imperfect human beings, but they wrote a document that was bigger than themselves. And I believe that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were inspired because so many of the people involved were strong believers, and they wanted America to be a great nation that honored God.
It started decades ago in colleges, where we started allowing history professors, supposed history professors, to teach our kids that America was founded on oppression. That's the real roots of the 1619 Project. It originates from Howard Zinn and other debunked historians, and these professors in these universities where our parents and our kids were paying tens of thousands of dollars a year to go to, had been indoctrinated into this anti-American whitewashing or blackwashing, I don't know what you would call it, but this revision of America as this tyrannical state, this patriarchy where they wanted to centralize control.
Howard Zinn, it turns out, was aligned with the KGB and was a bit of a mess of a person. And you don't let people like that write the history books for your children. Like, you keep them away from your kids, right? Like, that's a common sense. Sometimes we don't exhibit that when we set up our curricula in this country. So.
We saw people in the streets burning down our cities, causing riots, making threats about turning this country into a socialist country. And then this Black Lives Matter organization comes out of nowhere, and they post their agenda online, and it's all about destroying the traditional family. It's about defunding police officers. It's about overturning capitalism and replacing it with communism. And we thought, this 1619 Project seems to be part of something much bigger than that.
And now children are taught essentially a Marxist view of the weather.
Reasonable people can disagree about global warming, about how bad it is, but in the classroom, beginning in the earliest grades and extending right through the universities, children are being frightened intentionally. Children are being taught they have no future. Girls are being taught they can't have babies because every baby is a carbon bomb and will end up destroying the planet. This is unacceptable. This can't be done. This is not education. It's indoctrination. And the notion that unless we do massive changes in our economy, turn over almost all of our economy to the government, let the government tell us what we can eat, what kind of clothes we can wear, what our thermostat has to be set at, what we can drive, when we can use a plane, that unless we do all those things, and now 11 and a half years, the world's going to be destroyed, that's insanity. And in fact, that hot air is probably increasing the temperature of the earth.
Furthermore, despite its murderous track record, socialism is often promoted in our schools. That's why millions of American youth claim to prefer socialism over capitalism.
I think the left has done a very good job of creating a group of supporters that are very active. They can often be called social justice warriors, but let me give you an example. There is no, in 5,500 years of recorded history, you cannot point to any socialistic nation that has increased freedom and increased prosperity for the people. And yet right now, 75% of students in college support socialism, think it's the best form of government.
So what can be done about improving education today? Are there other options for parents than the local public school?
So parents who are concerned about that have two choices. One, they can fight against it, and they should, or they can avoid it, and they can choose some other form of education. I'm a homeschooling parent of 7 children, and I will tell you that I cannot imagine a better way for you to educate your children than to do it yourself within the context of your family or including grandparents as well.
Ultimately, the most important person in the child's education gets back to one thing: the parents or parent.
You know, children are designed to be influenced by those under whose authority they are, okay? And so parents, teachers in schools have an incredible responsibility. And when they're teaching children, those children are absorbing everything. They're watching them, they're listening to them. When you look at the Bible, it clearly teaches that we as parents must teach our children. You can see in Deuteronomy, in Psalms, in Proverbs, that God has assigned parents the responsibility to train up a child in the way that they should go, so they won't depart from it.
Because so many Christian parents have handed their children over to the secular world for their education, it has often been a thorny issue to discuss, since people become defensive about the choices they've made. But we can no longer be silent or complacent for fear of upsetting someone. While there are good people working within it, our American public education system has failed our children and led a growing generation away from God and truth. Dr. Kennedy steps where many others fear to tread in this portion of his message, A Godly Education.
If there is one thing which is made abundantly clear both in the Old Testament and the New, it is that children are a gift from God, that they are loaned to us for a little while, and that we as parents are responsible to give to them a godly education. That we are to rear them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that line upon line and precept upon precept, His truth is to be taught to them. Now, today, we live in a time when there are powerful forces that are engaged in an effort to see that that education is nullified and that instead they receive a godless education. This has, of course, been a cause of great concern to many, and we might ask ourselves, how did it come about that so many of our children today are indeed brainwashed in godless secularism in so-called Christian America? Consider the history of education in this country for a moment. From 1620, when the Pilgrims landed, Until 1837, virtually all education in America was private and Christian for 217 years. So the basis of America lay with private and Christian education. Virtually all of the colleges were established for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, or some other such statement as that. Today, we have 27 million illiterates, and it is estimated by some that there are 30 million more functional illiterates in this country. The Department of Education commissioned a national commission for a study on excellence in education entitled A Nation at Risk. Listen to what they said. They spent 18 months in intensive, thorough study of education in America. They said, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. We have, in effect, been committing an act of unthinking, unilateral educational disarmament. A nation at risk indeed. My friends, what the National Commission on Excellence in Education is saying is that our public educational system has been engaged in a virtual act of war on America, which has placed the very survival of this nation at risk. It is interesting that between 90 and 100 years ago, one great theologian in this country, at a time when most people were totally oblivious of the direction that the public educational system was moving, saw with an eagle eye the direction that education was taking. And that was Dr. A.A. Hodge of Princeton. Dr. Hodge and his father, Charles Hodge, are considered probably the two most outstanding theologians America ever produced. He had a voluminous education, he had a tremendous intellect, and he was a tremendous scholar. And he said, over 90 years ago, the following. Listen well. You would almost think that he were a prophet. Quote, I am as sure as I am of Christ's reign that a comprehensive and centralized system of national education, separated from religion as is now commonly proposed, will prove the most appalling enginery for the propagation of anti-Christian and atheistic unbelief and of anti-social nihilistic ethics, individual, social, and political, which this sin-rent world has ever seen. He is saying that a state public education system separated from religion will become the most atheistic, anti-Christian, nihilistic system the world has ever seen. Well, he was indeed a prophet. My friends, the anti-Christian, anti-God bias, the censorship of all things Christian, and the infusion of an atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, one-world, anti-American system of education in our public schools has indeed become such that if it had been done by an enemy, it would be considered an act of war. My friends, and this is not to indict all public school teachers. As I said before, there are some who are trying to do the very opposite of this. But it is to indict the humanist educational elite who are trying knowingly to foist this off on all of the public schools. They are literally at war with America and have brought this nation into a situation where it is, quote, a nation at risk, said the National Commission for excellence in education. Thank God that the fastest growing segment of education in America today and of numerous other countries is again Christian private education. It is growing far more rapidly than any other segment. You as a parent are responsible and will give an account to God for providing for your children a godly education. Dear friends, wake up to what's happening to our kids in America before it's too late.
Since Dr. Kennedy first preached those words, there has been an enormous boom in homeschooling as well, which is also part of the solution. In an increasingly secular world where Marxist ideology and woke progressivism are spread with evangelistic zeal through our schools, media, and parts of our government, it is absolutely essential to seek the mind of God on all of our cultural controversies. That's why I have written the brand new book, The War on Truth, Biblical Light for the Battle of Our Time. And I want to send it to you as my thanks for your generous donation to help us proclaim truth and defend freedom. Simply write to us at D. James Kennedy Ministries, Box 11154, Fort Lauderdale, Florida 33339, or call toll-free 877-962-7677, or go online to djkm.org. In The War on Truth, which features well over 100 short commentaries, John Rabe and I seek to shine a biblical light on many of the confusing and divisive issues in our culture. We include sections on the assault on free speech, the courts and the Constitution, gender confusion, and much, much more. These are short, incisive commentaries, and they will clear the fog around these divisive issues and help you articulate your own Christian convictions. And if you are able to give a generous donation of $100 or more, we will send you my brand new book plus a new DVD program we just produced called The Hope for the Future of Freedom. In this DVD program, we investigate the different ways that freedom is under attack in America, and we provide hope for recapturing that freedom by God's grace. It features expert guests like former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, as well as documentary segments investigating gender confusion and the reputational terrorism of cancel culture. And on top of that, we will also send you a new sermon booklet featuring one of Dr. Kennedy's most eye-opening and well-beloved messages, Will the Church Forget? This is his alarm bell to awaken the church to the loss of America's Christian foundations. We will send that entire bundle of resources to you as our thanks for your generous gift of $100 or more. And please, we need you to stand with us now to continue boldly declaring the Word of God. And thanks to generous friends who have established a $150,000 Proclaim Freedom Matching Challenge Fund, your generous donation right now will be effectively doubled dollar for dollar up until the end of the month. Time is short to see your impact doubled because we're ending our fiscal year on June 30th. But with your kind help now, we can finish strong and move forward aggressively against cancel culture and the onslaught of the far left with its atheistic ideology. So please, contact us immediately. Simply write to us at D. James Kennedy Ministries, Box 11154, Fort Lauderdale, Florida 33339, or call toll-free 877-962-7677, or go online to djkm.org. As the COVID pandemic forced children all across the country back into the home to learn remotely, an interesting thing happened. Parents, often to their shock, discovered what their children were actually learning. In one recent case in Missouri, parents reported a race-centered curriculum teaching critical race theory and advocating hatred for police. The district's classes were being conducted by an online tool called Canvas. After some parents criticized the curriculum, a district staff member wrote to principals in the schools telling them, quote, "This doesn't mean we throw out the lesson and find a new one. Just pull the resource off of Canvas so parents cannot see it," end quote. Such cases have multiplied across the country, and often for the first time, parents have gotten an inside look at the far-left indoctrination their children are undergoing. This is a difficult fact that we must face. Even Bible-believing Christians have too often handed over their children to the government for their education, an education that is explicitly and necessarily atheistic in its orientation. How can we then be surprised that a generation walks away from the faith when they spend 30+ hours a week under indoctrination, teaching either explicitly or implicitly that God has nothing to do with history, mathematics, science, or anything else worth knowing? In a culture that awards virtue points for departing as far as possible from the Christian tradition on most issues, parents can no longer hand the education of their children off to woke secularists. God commands parents to bring up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That is God's own education mandate. Theologian J. Gresham Machen was a defender of the Christian faith in the early 20th century when it was under attack by Darwinism, modernism, and other unbelieving theories. Machen once said, "I can see little consistency in a type of Christian activity which preaches the gospel on street corners and to the ends of the earth, but neglects the children of the covenant by abandoning them to a cold and unbelieving secularism." Friends, I say this not to shame anyone, but a cultural warning bell has been rung. The question becomes, will we trust God and do something about it? D. James Kennedy Ministries is standing for truth and defending your freedom. I'm Frank Wright. Thanks for being with us, and here's a look at the next truths that transform.
The current penchant towards socialism is compounded upon at least a generation of miseducation of the American populace.
That's next week. This has been a production of D. James Kennedy Ministries.